Hey, everybody, welcome back to Real Time Immigration. I'm really lucky to be joined today for a special episode by Simon Hankinson. He's a senior research fellow in the Border Security and Immigration Center at the Heritage Foundation from 1999 to 2022. He was a Foreign Service officer serving in India, Fiji, Ghana, Slovakia, Togo, Washington, D.C., Marseille, and Nairobi. And prior to entering the State Department, Simon worked as a lawyer in London, taught history, English and drama at a private school in Miami. So a very diverse background. But today we're going to focus a lot on Simon's work at Heritage and what he's doing or in his previous work in the Foreign Service. So Simon, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited for the conversation.
Glad to be with you.
We'll get into some of the topics that I'm looking forward to picking your brain on. But first, can you maybe fill in the lines of your professional background a little bit and then maybe share a bit more about the work you're doing now at Heritage?
Well, let's see. I've had many jobs. I've had about 24 jobs in my life. The shortest of which was as a pizza delivery guy for 3 hours in the late 80s. But my jobs on the scoreboard, at least, were as a lawyer originally, and then I was a teacher, and then I joined the Foreign Service and was there for 23 years. You mentioned all the places I went. I would say for at least 3 of those tours, I was doing visas most of the time. And citizen services. So I know my way around H's and L's and O's and B's and many others from that work. I've seen a lot of fraud in Ghana and India in particular, very high fraud posts, as well as highly qualified cases. And then I was in Africa. I was the charge d'affaires for a year and the deputy chief of mission at that embassy. So I didn't do visa work, and I didn't do that in Marseille either, where I was more giving speeches and laying wreaths and making friends with the French. And then here at Heritage, I've been here 3 years now in our Center for Border Security and Immigration, where I'm a senior research fellow, and I do a lot of media. I write lots of articles. I got one coming out on Fox today about the Hyundai plant where Immigration and Customs Enforcement found a lot of people, many of them from Korea, working illegally. So I look into the issues there with the different categories of visa and what might have been going on. And I'm working on a piece now that should come out pretty soon, a report on H-1B visas in particular. I've written on asylum, was the last big report that I did about how we should reform the asylum system in the U.S. to cope with the reality of the 21st century, which is mass economic migration as opposed to people fleeing communism or Nazis as they were maybe in the 30s and 50s. And I just came out with a book. It's called The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey. And I do talk about immigration and borders and sort of the big picture in 2 chapters. But I lick every third rail from, fat acceptance to gender ideology to try to make those issues a little more comprehensible and have the conversation so we can reach some common ground and pass, sane laws to preserve our society.
Yeah, it wasn't on the agenda, but I'd love to ask you about your piece on the Hyundai raid, and we can feature the Fox piece in the show notes as well, so folks can go and read it. But before we get into that, just one more question on your background. What made you want to make the jump when you left the State Department after a long career there into policy research and joining Heritage? What was sort of the drive behind that for you?
Well, I'll be honest, I wasn't actively seeking to leave, but I noticed that the climate at the State Department, because of the Biden administration's obsession with identity politics, with diversity, equity, and inclusion, had made it very difficult for people like me to advance. There was a discrimination there. I've written about this that was just really blatant in favor of oppressed, marginalized, whatever you want to call them, groups that did not include me. And I thought, I had a great job. I loved working for the government. I could stay here another 10 years and basically bump along at the same level. But if anything interesting came up, particularly an opportunity to speak and to write, which I really love to do, and you can't do when you work for the government. You just have to toe the party line, which I accepted. And I had this amazing offer to come to Heritage to start at this brand new border security and immigration center in the middle of what's going to be historically viewed as the biggest immigration and border disaster in U.S. history. And they made me an offer I couldn't refuse. So I thought, it's now or never. Go before you get pushed. And so I made the leap, and I've been absolutely thrilled to be here. I've written a couple hundred articles. I've done hundreds of media appearances, and I think I have more impact and more ability to explain things to people and to get the message out than I ever would have had if I'd stayed in the State Department.
Sure. Yeah, and I want to maybe talk a little bit more about that because in the State Department you served under various presidential administrations and then came out into sort of private life in the think tank world under the Biden administration, and now we're into the second Trump administration. Really, where I want to focus in on now that we're roughly 9 months into the second Trump administration is, in your view, what's the biggest difference in how current leadership at DHS and the State Department under the Trump administration is approaching regulatory reform and new immigration policies compared to the first Trump administration from 2017 to 2021?
I thought you were about to say compared to the Biden administration, that's a softball. I could have hit that out of the park. The comparison of DJT 45 to 47 is harder. I think they are better organized. I know it doesn't always look like that from the outside. They're obviously having a hard time getting all of their senior people confirmed. They've had a few misses with senior people where they've picked someone who either wasn't interested in the job or wasn't confirmable, or who they decided to replace with someone else. But by and large, if I had to compare the two, I would say they were more ready, more prepared this time. I don't honestly think that even the inner circle of the Trump campaign expected to win in 2016. And so they scrambled to catch up, and they did a lot of good things. They put good people in good jobs. And I had friends who were there trying to carry out really urgent, necessary reforms in immigration policy in particular, but they just didn't have the time. And the other side ran out the clock with lawsuits and administrative slow rolling from the deep state, basically the resistance to any change. But this time they're much more strategic about it. I would describe the approach as instead of like a single file assault where you go over the trench and you just get mowed down by the machine guns, they're advancing all across the line. They're attacking on all fronts. And so they know they're going to get shot down. They're going to lose cases. We've got some district court judges that are exceeding their authority, frankly, by making temporary restraining orders and injunctions and doing things that they don't, I believe, have the judicial authority to do. But they're not going to win at every turn. And the Trump administration has had some victories. So they're trying everything all at once to try to carry out the policies that President Trump promised he would do. And they're having much more success. And if they're able to get their nominees into position, as I understand is possible with changes to the Senate, then they're going to be even more effective. So that's the biggest difference, I think, is just more serious in purpose, better staffed, and much more knowledgeable about what the issues are and how to fix them.
Yeah, certainly. And I've seen that in my work as well. I do a podcast every week recapping the immigration news and the policy changes from that week. And when we started it back in May, I sort of thought, oh, we're never going to have enough immigration specific news to cover each week to make each episode interesting. It's the exact opposite. Every week, it's hard to fit everything into 1 hour because the Trump administration is doing so much so quickly and in a very sophisticated way that is different than the first Trump administration, in my opinion, where a lot of the announcements were a lot more sort of surface level, unclear. When new things come out, they are a lot more detailed than they were before. And that sort of segues me into my next question, which is I just want to ask you about your assessment of the overall state of the U.S. immigration system right now that we're about 9 months into the Trump administration. So maybe to be more specific, I'll frame it like this. What's going well in the current system? What's going poorly but is trending in the right direction? And what's broken but not getting enough attention right now by the Trump administration?
It's a good question. I've made some notes because I didn't want to forget anything. I'll leave things out, but I'm just going to give you my kind of top five. Building the wall is important. Do walls stop people from crossing 100%? No, absolutely not. But it's a complete lie to say they don't work. We had Hadrian's Wall. We had the Great Wall of China. We have walls right now between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. Walls prevent people from easily crossing from place A to place B. And we had a ridiculous system where it was out of 1,800 miles of border, there were these giant gaps, and sometimes little small gaps of 100 yards where they just downed tools and left the materials there so that people could just walk over the wall. I saw that in Yuma, Arizona, for example, and in parts of California. So I think building that barrier so we have we channel people towards places where they can actually get their due process, or they can be expelled if that's what the law calls for. That's a good thing. Interior enforcement, equally important. In addition to not releasing hundreds of thousands of people every month with no background checks, no clue who they are, and absolutely no legal right to be here other than the possibility that they'll claim asylum, you have to then carry out immigration law. If someone claims asylum and they are given asylum, they get to stay. If they claim asylum and they are refused asylum and they get a final order of removal, you have to remove them, or else the whole system is an entire joke. If you arrest somebody for drunk driving and you convict them and then you say, well, we're just going to throw the conviction out the window, you've wasted all that time and all that money and you've put someone back on the street. Immigration law is like every other kind of law. For it to have credibility, to make people do the right thing, you've got to carry out whatever the decisions are. And if there are laws on the books, you can change them. You can advocate to change them, raise the numbers of immigrants, make more in this category or less in that. But if you don't carry out what Congress passes, the laws that are on the books, then we become, a third world country. We become a joke. And I've lived in those countries, trust me, where there are laws on the books that just simply don't get enforced. So that's number 2 is interior enforcement. And that brings me to number 3, which is you've got to go to the sanctuary cities, which are basically, let's face it, all the big cities. LA, New York, Chicago, Boston. It's, with the exception maybe of Florida and a few other states. These are cities where, for a long time now, the mayors, the elected politicians have told the police, do not cooperate with immigration and customs enforcement. So let's say you have a gangbanger who's arrested for drunk driving, but he is wanted he has a federal immigration process and he should be deported. He's got a final order of removal, or if he's a violent offender, he can be removed after he gets his immigration process on top of the criminal process. So ICE will put in a detainer request. They'll say to the, let's just say it's Boston, they arrest him. When you guys are done with this guy, with his criminal process, could you please let us know? We'll come and pick him up and then give him his administrative immigration process, at the end of which he'll either be released or, if necessary, removed to another country. Nobody gets hurt because it happens, behind the scenes, maybe in the jail, and not on the street. And these cities and states would ignore that and just release people out on the street, which meant that either they went back in and often hurt people, killed people in their own neighborhoods, or ICE had to go and find them, which was difficult, expensive, and risky. So they're going into these cities and saying, no, you do not have the right to resist federal law. You can elect people to Congress and change that law, but while it's there, it is our duty to enforce it, and you are not allowed to impede federal officers going about their duty. In fact, it's illegal to do so. Number 4, he ended parole, or at least he ended the illegal parole programs that President Biden had used to admit, I think, over 1.5 million people. And anyone who seriously studies immigration and immigration law realizes that that was completely against the intent of the parole provision in the Immigration and Nationality Act. It was an absolute travesty. I know there are people on the libertarian right, the business right, and on the far left who want mass immigration, who will say, no, he had every right to parole, 30,000 Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans a month, and anyone waiting for an immigrant visa from countries that they liked, and all of Venezuela, and all of Ukraine. And anyone who used the CBP One app on their telephone, they'll say, yeah, that was perfectly legal. It was legal in the sense that if you have discretion to do something, you can push that discretion, far beyond the intent of the people who gave it to you. But I think stopping that was another win for the Trump administration. And finally, they're putting America first in immigration. Ultimately, we are not here to serve foreign clients. That's not what immigration policy is there to do. It is there to benefit the United States. So we bring in the number and the type of immigrants that we need to make this country better, and not the number and type of immigrant that the entire rest of the world wants. So they're enhancing student visa vetting. They are blocking visas from particular places. I think from the Palestinian territories now because of the ongoing violence there. They're blocking visas to people who have undermined U.S. foreign policy and U.S. interests through a variety of different ways. And they're flipping the script so that the lens through which we view immigration is about U.S. national security and economic benefit first, and not the benefit of the rest of the world. On the bad side, so I'm writing a paper about H-1Bs now. I think there are the sort of F-1 to optional practical training to H-1B pipeline, the L-1 visa. There are various other ways, abuses of the visa waiver program, of the B-1, B-2 visa. There are various ways in which hundreds of thousands of jobs are being taken from American citizens, American graduates, and legal immigrants every year. And we badly need to put those visas back in their appropriate place so that they are used for the appropriate purpose, so that an L-1 is used to transfer an executive from a company to the United States for a couple of years rather than as a backdoor to an H-1B. And so that a B-1, B-2 visa is not used as a fake H-1B for someone to work illegally, and on and on. So that's something I think they really need to work on. It's obviously much more complicated than enforcement in the interior. I think we'd all agree. One thing I agree with my left-wing friends on is that the system needs to be more efficient and faster. Now, I worked on this when I was at the State Department in the visa office more than 10 years ago. I was charged with trying to find ways to innovate and make certain things better. And I came up with some, and I learned very quickly how difficult it is to get any kind of positive change in the government. It's not impossible, but you are banging your head against a wall. And so I hear this from both sides, people, lawyers and immigrants themselves, who are legit and have a real case and are qualified. They want their case to be decided quicker, and they don't want to go through all the hassle. I fully agree with them on that. There are also employers for H-2As and H-2Bs, for example, that are crying out for laborers that they've had coming year after year after year, and they're saying, why is it so expensive and so complicated? You're making it impossible for me to do my business. So I want to see improvement in those systems so that the legal channels for work visas and immigration are expedited and made simpler. And I have lots of ideas on how to do that. We have technology now emerging that is so powerful that it really ought to take this system and yank it out of the mid 20th century where it's still stuck in many respects and bring it into the 21st century. And then, the overall strategy should be, we need to limit immigration. I don't believe in open borders, and I do not think that everybody in the world has a right to compete with Americans for jobs. However, where we do decide to have channels, we got to make them fast, cheap, and easy.
I think on the latter, having been in the immigration law community for a lot of my career, you're right. Everyone, regardless of their political leanings on immigration policy, would agree that the system needs to be much quicker on the government side as well. I love that. I want to unpack some of your thoughts and opinions and ideas for H-1B and L reform, and maybe some of the policy tweaks that can be made in the current system around that. But and I want to talk about F1 OPT as well, because that's a big issue. But before we get into that, you mentioned before we started recording that you have a piece that came out today on Fox News about the Hyundai raid. And so I've seen a lot of conflicting reporting on what exactly happened with that. Could you maybe just give your point of view and an overview of what's in that article and what you think happened there?
Yeah, it was supposed to be out this morning on Fox. I'm speculating here, so I don't have any inside information, so take it for what it is. But there are two elements I talk about in the article. One is who were these people and actually what status were they on? And there I conclude that you would have had a mix. You would have had some, you're allowed to send people on a B1, B2 visa if they are, for example, installing proprietary equipment or doing very specific training. So let's say Hyundai is building this factory. They're bringing in, Korean-made equipment that's all written in Korean. They want to install it and it's proprietary. They don't want just any Tom, Dick, and Harry to work on that equipment. They need their technicians. So they send them on a B1, B2. That can be done. And maybe they need those technicians to train American technicians, so they have to have that. But there were also probably some people there on H-1Bs and Ls. But the one problem there is that because there are so many body shops, many of them based in India, who are bringing in people to work at low-level, entry-level jobs on H-1Bs, and they're scamming the L system, it's choking up the market for legitimate companies trying to invest in the United States that have very clear cases that could be adjudicated pretty quickly. So that's a problem in the pipeline with the H's and the L's. And then it appears they had some people just outright working illegally, not from Korea, but from Latin America as well and other countries. And then it's possible, I think it's probable, that some of the hundreds of Koreans who they found working illegally were on the visa waiver program and had either crossed over or flown into the country, I would imagine, rather than crossed over the border, and they'd entered under visa waiver and were working, which is absolutely illegal under that program. They're only allowed to come in for 90 days for business or pleasure. So I'm thinking it's got to be a mix of all those. My hypothesis is that Hyundai is a giant company. They can afford decent lawyers and advisors. I would find it hard to believe that they were dumb enough to think that they could get away with employing people on visa waiver. I would think it more likely, and again, anything's possible, more likely that they were relying on subcontractors, maybe Korean American subcontractors, who were selling them labor and saying, oh, we got it all taken care of. These guys are all legit. And then Hyundai kind of got caught with their pants down. The second thing I talk about in the article is, look, you got the technical people at the high end and maybe a few L1 executives and trainers, whatever, but the bulk of the people working in this factory, from the machine operators down to the people, parking the cars and cleaning the floors and running the cafeteria, are supposed to be Americans from Georgia. That's why the government gave them a giant tax break of billions of dollars. So where are those people available? Well, maybe they are for certain jobs, but the latest NAEP National Report Card showed us that we have actually lost ground since 1991 in math and in reading and in all of the things that make people employable. So that is a giant problem that we have here of lowering standards and basically churning out half of our high school graduates who are almost unemployable. So we domestically have a problem. We've got to get people who are on the fence back into the workforce. 25% of high school educated U.S. born men from 20 to 65, give or take, are out of the workforce entirely. They've got to be brought back in with, carrots of higher wages and sticks of you can't get all the benefits by just sitting around if you're healthy and able-bodied. And we need to educate the young people coming into the workforce so that companies like Hyundai will want to employ them, so they show up on time and they're not stoned, and they can add 5+5 and they can speak and read English at a functional level. So we've got a challenge domestically, and then we've also got a challenge with law enforcement on the immigration side. And all of that sort of came together to make the Hyundai situation.
What you said about the sort of backlog in the H-1B system and for L visas and that leading companies to sometimes use Bs inappropriately, it really struck a chord, because when I was an immigration paralegal and we would talk with managers who wanted to send their employees over to do exactly what you just mentioned on the B, training or installing something that's proprietary, oftentimes we would really have to dive into what exactly that individual was going to do in order for them to go in to a consulate and request and apply for that B visa. And oftentimes if the company, if the determination was made like, hey, this person actually really needs to apply for an L1B, right, to go and do this work. The work that is in their SOW just isn't going to be permissible under the B. They'd say, okay, well, how long is the L going to take, and what's the chances of approval, right? And at the time, L1Bs were very long wait times for visa interviews in many countries, and were difficult to get. They had a high denial rate. So I'm curious to ask you, as a former Foreign Service officer and somebody who did visa interviews and issued visas, the B1 program and sort of the gray area between the B and the L and the H, et cetera. Do you think that that's clear enough currently, or do you think under the FAM, or do you think that it needs to be made clear to both Foreign Service officers adjudicating visas, but also to employers and employees?
It is anything but clear. I remember the fam and I were, joined at the hip, and I would be consulting it daily back when it was a paper version, not online. And the B1 in lieu of H section is, pages and pages of exceptions where you can come on a B and still, kind of do this work, but not that work. And it was really hard for us to interpret and for companies to interpret as well. So that could be made more clear. But when I was talking about L's, one of the issues there was that so I won't name the company, but there was an Indian company. I was in New Delhi from my first tour, and an awful lot of the top 10 recipients of visas are outsourcing or body shops that are either based in India or in the United States, run by people who originally came in from India. And 75% of the H-1Bs are given to people from India, and I don't know what it is for Ls, but I imagine it's pretty high as well. And what you had and this is talking about the year 2000, this big company, which was an outsourcing firm, was hiring people they would hire them for exactly 12 months and a day and then apply for an L1 visa, an intra-company transfer. And like I said, when you read the FAM, this is supposed to be for, your Volvo, and you have a senior executive and you need him at your Birmingham, Alabama branch. So you send him and his family on this L1. He's a highly paid executive, or at least a well-paid executive. He runs that part of the operation. Meanwhile, maybe an American company like Ford sends an executive to Sweden and they do the same thing over there. You can see how that would be necessary and it would make sense. But what they were doing is they were bringing in consultants. So the consultant would technically work for the Indian firm in America. They would set up an American subsidiary. But they weren't doing anything for that firm, like the Volvo guy was working for Volvo. They were sending that guy, that consultant, out to work for another firm as a hired hand. So that was not the purpose of the L1 visa, but they hired very expensive lawyers and they got around the restrictions so that they could use the L in lieu of an H. And that stopped people who genuinely were using L for its intended purpose from using the L. So I think a lot of work can be done to clarify the rules on the B, but fundamentally the B should not be used in lieu of other visas. It should be easier to get those visas for legitimate purposes, and they should be denied for people who are just trying to use them to work.
Yeah. I want to pivot to F1 visas because back in May, you wrote an article that caught my attention. It was featured in the Washington Examiner titled Foreign Student Visas Need Limits. And we'll link that in the show notes so folks can go and read it. But can you unpack the key takeaways from that article for listeners and sort of what you laid out in it?
One key point, or the first key point, is that student visas are non-immigrant visas. The idea behind them is that foreign nationals come to the United States, go to school for 4 years, 6 years, whatever, get a degree, then go back to their home country, wherever it is, and use that knowledge to build up their country. Yes, I think we've always wanted to retain some. Some are going to get married. Some are going to be so brilliant that someone wants to hire them, or they're so brilliant they do a Zuckerberg and start a company while they're still in their dorm. But the majority should be returning home, and there should not be an expectation that a student visa is an immigrant visa. But it has become a de facto immigrant visa for certain people, particularly from certain developing countries where there's very little opportunity back in their home countries. So that's one general theme, and not every country is the same. If you look at our two biggest student visa senders, you got India and China. They're very different. The Indian student visa population, the biggest issue is about migration because many of them are coming and believe that they are on a track to permanent migration. So there are issues connected with that. With the Chinese, there's a very different issue, which is espionage and stealing of industrial secrets and of laboratory research and so on, often funded by or required by the Chinese government. It's much, much less of an issue with other countries. So we have to factor that into our decisions when it comes to issuing visas. A third stream is the Palestinian question, the war going on in Gaza, which is it is tangentially of interest to the United States. Israel is an ally. We certainly wish no ill to the Palestinian people, and we would love to have the situation in the Middle East resolved so that everybody could be less miserable than they are now. But we don't want that political question settled on the streets of the United States and on the campuses of Columbia University and George Washington University and Harvard. And we don't want students to be protesting such that they stop other students who would rather do their studying from studying. And so Secretary Rubio has declared some students, a fairly small number, as that their presence is contrary to U.S. national interests, to U.S. foreign policy. He has that power under Section 237 of the INA, and according to our law, those students can be deported on those grounds. They have also revoked visas for a fairly small number of the, I think, 1.5 million foreign students that are here now. They've revoked a couple of thousand visas for mostly criminal activity. Students, drunk driving, theft. They're people. A small percentage of them do stupid things. And in the past, we've really given them almost a pass on that, and just let students do whatever they want. If you're coming here, if you've told the consular officer you're coming to study at Columbia, you spend 80% of your time on the campus with a megaphone yelling about how you hate capitalism, you hate the United States, you want Israel to be destroyed. You are not doing what you said you were going to do. And so arguably you've misrepresented your purpose of traveling to the United States. And we should, thank you for your visit, but you need to go home. So that's a change that we're seeing under the Trump administration. And another issue is when we're talking about what number of students should stay and what number should go home, we cannot use student visas as a cheap labor program. And I think that's what we're increasingly doing with OPT in particular. It's got to be America first in terms of immigration and in terms of who gets a student visa and on what terms. And as I say, we certainly do want to retain some of the best and most talented students, but it should not be an automatic expectation that everybody stays. And I think that's kind of where we've been for the past couple of decades. And we're seeing now the demographics of the United States changing. We are having fewer children, native-born Americans. I mean, I'm an immigrant, so I probably don't count that stat. But Americans, generally speaking, are having fewer children, and our fertility is declining, and the population of college-aged kids is smaller than it was for Generation X or the baby boomers before them. So what you'll see is a screaming from the less competitive universities and colleges out there. We need unlimited foreign students. That's the only way to pay the bills, because they've gotten hooked on this drug of foreign students paying full freight. So Chinese paying 60, 70, 80,000 a year to go to Berkeley and MIT and so on. And then even community colleges and much less well-known institutions who are reliant on huge streams of marginal students. Now in Canada and the United Kingdom, you have seen what happens when they brought in millions of foreign students from basically a few countries who were scraping the bottom of the barrel. They got the top ones, and then they just kept moving down and down and down. And then you had these strip mall colleges where they didn't teach them anything. They had no academic standards. They were just a visa mill and a diploma mill to bring people in. It was an immigration racket, frankly. I don't think we want to go there. So if that means that some universities are going to close, so be it. At the hometown I grew up in, we had 4 elementary schools in the 50s during the baby boom. And when I was growing up in the 70s, 2 of them were mothballed because the population of kids was smaller. And then in the 2010s, they opened them back up again because they had a lot of immigration from, I think it was Central America, and so they had more kids. Well, universities should not expect to live forever. If we have too many institutions of higher education teaching useless degrees, or at least degrees that do not make you more employable, and some of those have to go to the wall and find other purposes, then that's okay. That's the way markets work. We cannot allow or make education exist as a welfare program for marginal institutions of higher education.
Yeah, and shortly after you published that piece in the Washington Examiner, the State Department, they didn't announce it, but it was leaked to Politico that they were pausing visa appointments, interviews, or scheduling visa appointments, I should say, for F1 students and then also J1 exchange visitors as well. That pause lasted about 20 days, and a lot of universities have since reported, not necessarily totally because of that pause, but some are attributing it to that 15, 20, even 30% of their foreign student enrollment is dropped year over year. I want to ask you about the social media vetting policies that were implemented after that pause was lifted. Specifically, as a former consular officer, a former foreign service officer, what's your analysis of the new procedure? Again, the State Department didn't necessarily release information on what the social media vetting was going to look like, but there was a memo that was leaked to the public, or to reporters that then leaked to the public, about sort of some details on the social media vetting procedures. What's your take as a former foreign service officer on what that showed? Do you think it is going to cause more backlogs for students looking to apply for visas? And if so, do you think maybe that's worth it given the necessity for the procedure to be put in place?
Well, first, I'm always disgusted as a former foreign service officer whenever things are leaked. I mean, I'm not surprised, but whenever people say, "Well, we have a bipartisan, neutral civil service and foreign service, they're just doing their jobs, and it's wrong to say that they're," no, we have a percentage in the government that is doing everything they can to undermine anything the Trump administration does on reforming immigration, and they should be ashamed. It's not their job to make policy; it's their job to carry it out. But as you said, the information's out there. Look, we all, as consular officers, we had to vet people who are in front of us. We had to interview them, figure out, are you legitimate? Do you have the degree you say you have? People lie about that all the time. You have someone who says they have a computer science degree and they know less than I do. I have a history degree and a law degree. You have to find out, are they really who they say they are? Is the right name, date of birth? Do they come from where they say they're coming from? Why are they going to the U.S.? Are they planning to go and study? Or are they just going to give up on day one and drive a truck or pump gas? So there's vetting that goes on, but with very poor information sources. So you have to use your gut and your knowledge and what was available at the time. Now we have artificial intelligence and search engines that are able to do data scraping at phenomenal rates. And I think with that technology, if we use it right, we will be able to vet students much more carefully and come up with a much more scientific score, risk assessment of, will this individual from this place going to this place of this age, are they likely to do what they say they're going to do? Are they likely to go get a 4-year bachelor's degree, or are they likely to drop out or become a terrorist or work illegally or whatever it is? So I do think it's a great idea to ramp up student vetting, and I also don't think it's a good idea for any country to admit people who hate them. I mean, that seems to me kind of rule number one. If a foreign student is hostile to the United States, does not believe in democracy or capitalism or wants to burn down the very system that they're going to take advantage of, I wouldn't give them a student visa. I don't think they qualify. So scraping their social media to figure out what they've said, if they've advocated for killing people who say things that they disagree with, or, as I say, destroying the very fabric of the Western society that they're coming to, they are not going to make great students, and they certainly are not going to make good Americans if they attempt to stay in the country. So I don't think in the long run it should slow things down too much, because as I say, we have this technology now that can be put to use and make all of what used to be really time consuming much, much quicker. And then in terms of ultimate numbers, a good student was always so obvious. You knew where they were going. They spoke as if they had studied what they said they had. Everything added up. And a marginal student was also obvious. It was the ones in the middle that were much harder. That's why we pay people to make those adjudications. And I think any tool that we can throw into that process that gives more information and provides harder data is really going to be helpful. For example, overstay rates. Some countries have huge overstay rates where it's like 50% of the people who get a visa don't come back. Well, then stop issuing to those countries, or at least ratchet down the issuance till you get to an acceptable overstay rate, whatever that is. And then other countries have a fantastically high rate of compliance. That's why we have a visa waiver program, because the compliance rate was so high for some of those countries that it was better. We were better off taking a chance on all of them for the most part than spending the time and resources to interview every single person when we knew that the approval rate was 99.9%. So overall, I think the increased vetting is a good thing. The process is always the problem, how you carry it out. And the goal should not be to slow things down, because that doesn't help everybody. It should be get a fast decision as quickly as possible so that everybody knows where they are. If a student is applying, they want to be told, bad news is better delivered quickly than dragged out.
I want to transition to the OPT program, sort of the end stage of coming to the school, coming to the United States as a foreign student, where many after they graduate seek out work in the U.S. and the OPT program enables them to do that. I've heard a lot of commentary from folks in the Trump administration, including USCIS Director Edlow, on the OPT program, and fairly recently, the text of a proposed rule was released by USCIS that would end the practice of admitting F1 students on duration of status, right? And most of the folks who are listening will know what that means, so we don't need to go into the weeds on it. But a result of ending duration of status would be that most of the students, if not all, who graduate from their 4-year degree or from their master's program, whatever it is, in addition to applying for an OPT EAD work authorization, which is already something that they need to do, they would also need to extend their F1 visas as part of it. And in the proposed rule, USCIS did a thorough analysis basically of what the impact would be. They estimate that about 200,000 students would graduate each year and would need to apply for that extension with USCIS. It would create a big volume of new cases that USCIS would then have to adjudicate. So with all of that background, Simon, I just want to ask for your opinion as a researcher, as a former Foreign Service officer on the OPT program in general, and what you think the goal of this proposed rule to end duration of status is from the Trump administration's perspective.
Well, duration of status, I think, was a bad idea. If you're going to do a 4-year degree, it should take you 4 years. If you do a master's, it should take you 2 more, PhD, whatever. Now, sometimes people take longer. That's okay. But as a general rule, we should be able to limit the status to the time they need to get the degree. Now, OPT, as you know, I'm sure, having been working on immigration for a while, is not statutorily authorized. It is a completely made-up program that has turned student visas into de facto working visas and de facto immigrant visas. That was not the idea. That's not in the statute. And so, frankly, I think the OPT program itself is probably, it's illegal. I mean, it shouldn't be there. So I'm not a fan of it. But if you're going to do it, then there should be a process where you have to have some scrutiny between the time that you graduate and the time that you get your job, so that questions can be asked. Did you graduate? Did you get the degree? Is this company you're going to legitimate? 200,000 sounds like an awful lot of people coming into the workforce. It sounds like it's almost an entitlement that people expect now that they graduate and they automatically get the right to work in the United States. We have unemployment now among recent graduates is about twice what it is among people in their 30s. So it's like 7% as opposed to 3.5%. And things are not appearing to get much better. So why should we be prioritizing for employment foreign nationals when our own American citizen students can't get jobs? That seems to me insanity. If we had a massive demand for labor, you could make the argument that OPT is a way to get people who are educated here in the United States, presumably speak English, and will be easier to assimilate than people coming fresh from outside. But if we are having an economic downturn, or the job market has slowed down because of competition from AI or any other reason, then I would think that would be the time to reduce OPT and put it back in the box.
I'm curious because I've heard a similar argument made by Joseph Edlow in his Senate confirmation hearing to be USCIS director. Why do you think the Trump administration is pursuing this rule to end duration of status as opposed to just making reforms or even eliminating the OPT program altogether? Or do you think that that's coming down the line at some point?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think they're completely connected. You can do one without the other. I think the duration of status question has been out there, and people like us have been advocating to get rid of duration of status and to make, I think, journalism visas. There's certain other categories that are also duration of status, to limit them to a more reasonable time period, so that there's at least another check. That's why I'm also against overseas renewals for visas. I don't. If you get an H-1B visa and you want to renew it or move to a new company, you should have some scrutiny on that case. I know there's so much fraud in those categories. Many of them are perfectly legitimate and easy to adjudicate, but there's a lot of fraud too. And so there should be some eyes on that case to see, did you get paid what you said you were going to get paid? Did you work where you said you were going to work? Is this new company legitimate, or do they have a long track record of fraud? So I think they're connected, but they're separate questions. And I can't honestly tell you whether the duration of status rule is then going to follow on to changes or reforms to OPT or not.
Yeah, fair enough. A lot of the immigration practitioners who listen to this podcast, I think the what they're most interested in is this is going to create a lot more work. This is going to create an extra step for many of their corporate clients who, in the past, have been able to hiring someone on F1 OPT was fairly straightforward. This doesn't necessarily make it significantly more complicated, but at the scale of what USCI estimates of being 200,000 potential new applicants each year, adding that extension component and the scrutiny and the processing time to it, I think is something that folks are concerned about or just watching very closely, to say the least.
But just on that one point, though, I'll say, is it possible that American companies, because this is a little more complicated and might take more time, might look for American graduates? And is that such a bad thing? If we have high unemployment among recent graduates, particularly STEM graduates of all things, they were told, learn to code. Well, many of them did, and now they can't get a job. So maybe these big employers, instead of jumping through all the hoops, and I realize, if you're an immigration lawyer, that's your bread and butter, but that's not it's not my problem today. If you're a big employer, you might think, well, I'm going to look harder to try to find American citizen graduates because I don't want to have to jump through all the hoops to get the F1. So there might be some logic behind that system, that decision.
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I do lump in with immigration practitioners, immigration lawyers, but also corporate immigration professionals who work at the big tech companies, usually under the HR function as well, who have a different perspective than the lawyers, obviously. Okay, Simon, I have two more questions for you.
Sure.
And this next one, I want to sort of leave more open for you to take in any direction you want. But I just want to talk about um, sort of the current state of H-1B, O-1, and L-1B programs, right? And you can attack this as a former foreign service officer, or I would love to hear a little bit more about the report that you're going to release soon on H-1Bs. But where do you think over the next 3.5 years under the Trump administration those programs are going to go? What direction?
Well, I would be speculating wildly because I haven't had any detailed conversations with anybody in the administration, and I don't know what their plans are, but I do know what the former Trump administration's plans were, and I know what we've written here at Heritage and other think tanks that are on the conservative side have written, and so my guess would be that it's going to be a matter of reining in some of the excesses that these categories have seen over the years. H-1B being the most egregious example where, the fraud, the outsourcing, the body shopping has just really been, it's eaten the program. It's taken, if you look at what H-1Bs say in the statute and what they're supposed to do and what Congress intended for them to do versus what they're actually doing now, it is a completely different ball of wax. It's now a de facto immigrant visa that benefits primarily one country, and that's not what it was written to be in the INA. L's, I think I talked about that before. Yeah, it needs some work so that the visa can do what it was intended to do. And it's possible that there'll be some tweaking of the rules or the FAM or whatever to make that more accessible to those who need it and qualify for it, and less to those who are trying to scam it to get around caps on Bs or Ls. And the O, well, I think that category could be expanded. If you look at some of the claimed H-1Bs, they actually could be O's. If you really are an individual of extraordinary ability in computing, say, I'm hearing stories that Meta and other AI firms are trying to poach each other's talent for like hundreds of millions of dollars, which is absolutely crazy to me. But I guess if that's what the market says, if a company is willing to pay someone $100 million or even $10 million or even $1 million a year to do a particular skill, that's pretty arguably an alien of outstanding ability and would be a slam dunk O visa as opposed to an H-1B. So that category, I think, could be much better used. And if I had to guess, I would say you will see some reform of those categories to put them back in line with what they were supposed to be and curb many of the abuses. I think on the H-2A, H-2B front, we might see reforms to make them work faster and better, so that employers have less of a hard time recruiting people that they need. But on the skilled worker visas, particularly if we go into an economic downturn and we start seeing a lot more pressure from Americans who are looking for jobs who've been fired, then you're not going to see those categories expanding the way they did for the past maybe 20 years.
I've seen a lot of Republicans in Congress talk a lot more about the H-1B program than I ever have before. And I know, banking on Congress doing anything is always is not a very sure bet at any point. But I think the conversation from Republican lawmakers is interesting. One signal that we've gotten in terms of H-1B reform, we don't know a lot about it yet, is the rule that was introduced and cleared White House review. I think it was titled something like the weighted selection for the
But
H-1B cap rule, something along those lines. The full text of the proposed rule hasn't been released yet, so we don't know a lot about it. We know that the Trump administration, the first time around, tried to introduce a rule that may be similar, but a lot of, I think, smart speculation is that that rule will favor in the lottery or some sort of reformed lottery registrants to the H. Oh no. Sorry, folks. We had a couple of technical difficulties. Simon joined us by his phone, so we're going to wrap this up. But Simon, just finishing my question on the weighted selection rule that we don't know a lot about yet because the text of the rule hasn't been released. The proposed rule, I should say, hasn't been released. What's your take on that? I know Heritage had a paper advocating for something similar to maybe what is in the rule, but curious for your take on maybe that potential reform.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would agree that while it was intended to bring in skilled specialty workers, the H-1B salary cap has been eroded by inflation over the years so that it's now basically just a cheap labor program. It doesn't mean that some people on H-1Bs aren't highly skilled and talented. It just means that they're swamped by people who are, entry level or just, routine workers. So we've advocated for something akin to a lottery an auction where the person willing to pay the highest gets the visa numbers, or ranking them according to the salary that a company is willing to pay, and it's got to be a legitimate company, of course, and that would make it so that only companies that were truly trying to hire top talent would bother to pay those fees, and they would cut out the body shops because of course they got to get their cut off the top, so they may be paying 70,000 but they're taking a cut. Those people would find it much, much harder to make a living. And I think that's in everybody's interest because they're workers being exploited. I never take this personally when I was doing interviews. It was never personal between me and the person on the other side of the window. They're trying to get ahead. They're trying to get a job. But it's not good for workers to come here and then be exploited by their employer because they can't leave their job and because they have to pay, 10% of their income back to the guy who got them the job in the first place. So that's a reform I'd really like to see, however they make it work. And I think that's a good thing for everybody.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of concern around litigation against the potential proposed rule. It's very confusing. I went back and read the INA. Based off of what I can tell, the creation of the lottery in the first place isn't even consistent with what's in the INA. So it's, I think, very confusing for folks on the outside on whether or not if USCIS makes reforms to the lottery or has something different like you proposed, an auction, whether or not they'd be able to do that or not and how quickly they'd be able to implement it. So definitely something we'll be keeping a close eye on. Um, Go ahead.
I was just say the one thing you can absolutely guarantee is that whatever this administration does on immigration reform, no matter how clearly it's legal under the INA or any other law, they're going to get sued. The lawsuits were already there on January 20th, ready to go, just had to fill in the names. And whenever it comes to rulemaking, arguably both sides have done this. I would say the Democrats more because they are more in favor of large scale immigration. But every time they try to change the rules, they get sued for the Administrative Procedures Act or on some premise or other. And so, yes, I would fully anticipate that this attempted rule change will be litigated.
Yeah, there were certainly instances of that when the Biden administration made reforms to the H-1B lottery as well. Um,
Exactly.
Okay, last question for you, Simon. Sort of a fun one to end it, but if you were made czar of the entire U.S. immigration system, I could ask you a layup like what are the five changes you would make to the overall system. But I want to dig into the weeds a little bit more. What's like one bureaucratic change, maybe something that isn't talked about a lot, folks don't really know a lot about, but one in the weeds bureaucratic change that you would make to the U.S. immigration system that you think would make a real pivotal impact going forward?
Well, I'm gonna cheat and look at my notes because I was about to make a new one up, but I know I wrote one down yesterday and see if I can figure out what it was.
We could have both too, if you want.
Yeah, there you go. Um, yeah, it's what I was going to say now. But when I was at the State Department and I was in this visa office, I was tasked with coming up with ideas. And one of the things I looked into was it was an automated interview. It was a box where it would take your picture, your fingerprints, your passport, all the necessary information, and give you an interview for 20 questions or so. And then it would gather all that data and then it would run it through. In those days, AI didn't exist yet, or at least it wasn't the way it is now. But basically, run every single thing about that person through a giant algorithm to figure out their risk score. And it could make the process so much faster because you could do that. I called it FAST. I've forgotten what it stood for, but PHAST. And you could have these boxes in remote locations. They wouldn't necessarily have to be at embassies, so that someone could complete 90% of the process before they even showed up to the embassy. And then the consular officer would have all the data would be there, so the person could just walk in and they could have facial recognition, just identify them, and then their fingers could be identified without actually having to do anything other than just put their hands on the countertop. And then the officer would have all the information to at least not all the information, but they would have most of the information that they needed to assess the risk score for this person. So if they were someone who had been on an H-1B with Microsoft, getting $150,000 a year, and they graduated from IIT in India, and they were going back, that would be a case that would have like a very low chance of risk and fraud, and you could spend very little time, and that would be an incredibly quick process. Whereas if they were going to go work at Pizza Hut on an L1, that maybe would have a higher risk flag, and that case could take the time that was needed. So I think that would be the change I would make. I would automate some of the functions of visa processing so that we could cut to the chase. Pay the human being to do what the human is good at, which is to make decisions, adjudicate cases, but not to do all the tedious back office stuff and the information scraping that takes everybody's time. Because that is one frustration, again, that I share with immigration lawyers and applicants, where we always agreed is that it should be easier and faster. Even if the result is a no, you want to know so you can get on with your life. And people don't like the doubt. I hear from people sometimes saying, well, I have an O1 or an H1 or whatever visa, and I want to go home for a funeral for this or that. Can I do it, or do I risk being stuck overseas? And I say, well, it really depends on your case. If you have a slam dunk case and there's no fraud indicators and there's no wait line at that embassy, you should be in and out. You're good to go. But there's always at the back of my mind, am I getting the whole story? Are there factors here that I don't know about? Is there some case in the works that is going to pounce on them when they get there due to fraud or whatever? So it's the uncertainty that I would like to take out of the system, and I could start doing that through a better use of automation and technology.
Yeah. Wow, Simon. That I could ask you a million more questions about that and other ideas that you have, but I'll be courteous of your time. I really appreciate you coming on today and sharing all of your thoughts and what you're working on. It's been a really thought provoking conversation. We'll put everything in the show notes, links to Heritage, links to your work, so people can go ahead and check that out. But is there anything you want to promote before we leave? Anything you're working on that you want folks to keep an eye out for?
Well, I always like people to read my reports. I know they're kind of in the weeds, but the one on H-1Bs I hope will be informative, and we always put the key points up front. I'm on X. It's now as at Watchful Waiter One. And you were kind enough to say earlier on, my book, The 10 Woke Commandments You Must Not Obey, is out. And I do talk about immigration from a sort of a high level perspective, and how I think it impacts our society and how we ought to approach it. But thanks again for having me on. It's been great.
Thanks so much, Simon. Have a good rest of your day.
All right, you too.